I thought I'd talk a little bit today about just the basic case for free trade, the way economists think about it, and what sort of evidence we have to bring to bear on this. And I was thinking, how can we think about trade, international trade, in a way that sort of reminds us or tells us why it's important? And it's a very simple way of thinking about it. So are any of you fans of avocados? Okay, it's big in the U.S. It's just become a new thing in the last 5 or 10 years or so. It wasn't, when I was growing up, we never really had avocados, but why Americans we're eating a crazy number of avocados. It's like breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They're always around, maybe in guacamole or what have you, and it's all because of international trade to some extent. And this is the pounds of avocados eaten per person per capita. In 1980s, late 20th century, it was about a pound, 2 pounds per person. And just in the past 10 years or so, it's soared up to about almost 9 or 10 pounds per person. So Americans really love avocados, and they're freely available. Now here's where sort of Trump comes in, because he has recently talked about imposing tariffs on Mexico, on goods coming from Mexico. So that's going to make those avocados that we Americans enjoy so much less abundant, much more costly, and is sort of interfering with sort of these preferences that people had. We didn't allow Mexican imports until 1996 or so. So it's really a new phenomenon that's become as a result of international trade. How about eggs? Did you have some eggs at breakfast this morning? Okay, Americans are also big egg eaters. And I don't know whether you have a problem here. Are prices of eggs really high in Israel at the moment? Okay, maybe it's a worldwide phenomena. But what's happened is it's not only is the price high, but we've had to sort of implicitly ration it. Now, we don't have formal rationing, so they just put up in supermarkets in the US these cards that say, please only buy 1 carton at a time. Don't try to stockpile eggs if you think the price is going to continue to go up. So it's not, the government's not enforcing rationing, but they're trying to limit sales and because there's this shortage of eggs. And you can see here the price of eggs. It's usually been about $1 per dozen, and just in the past couple of years, it shot up to almost $5 a dozen. And so it's become very expensive because there are fewer eggs out there. It's just as expensive as beef now, and other things like that. So well, first of all, the government is thinking about doing something about this. And there's an article in the New York Times that says that the Agriculture Department looks to import eggs as prices soar. So we've had this scarcity of eggs. We want to relieve that scarcity somehow. We can't just have more chickens overnight because of the flu. So how do we relieve that? Well, we buy more on the international market. We import. And this will bring us to Trump's theories a little bit later on, because President Trump has said if we impose tariffs, they don't increase prices. For some reason, he thinks that's the case. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But does that mean imports will reduce them? Well, yes, if we have a greater abundance of eggs coming in, the price will fall down, then we won't have to ration them. So what's linking these two things, avocados and eggs? Bought from Mexico. When we can import these things, we don't have to worry about the price so much, and there's a lot of them. That's sort of what trade is all about. And when we have these shortages, and if we don't import, we're going to be stuck with higher prices and a shortage of supply. So the basic message of everything I'm going to talk about for the next hour or so, and I should say, interrupt me at any point in time, raise your hand, or ask a question. I really welcome that. But the main point will be free trade leads to abundance, where you sort of don't have to worry about supply constraints, and if you close your market, you're going to have scarcity. We had a big shortage about 2 or 3 years ago, maybe it was even longer than that, of baby powder for milk, for infants. And we didn't allow international trade. And there was one plant in the US that was producing this. There were problems at the plant. The price went way up. Parents couldn't find this milk for their infants. And there was a great shortage. So these two things are related. Here's a cartoon, and this is throughout history. So this is a cartoon from Britain in the 19th century, early 20th century, contrasting the free trade shop with the protection shop. The protection shop being where the government's limiting imports to try to bolster domestic industry to become more self-sufficient, become a stronger economy. Well, what that leads to is, higher prices and fewer items, whereas the free trade shop, the cartoon's trying to suggest, is there's an abundance of goods at lower prices. And so this is sort of one of the themes throughout history. So let's that's sort of the overarching theme about abundance versus scarcity, open markets and trade versus closed markets. But let's get into this in a little bit more detail, if you're so inclined. Why is this an important policy? So what is trade? First of all, there's nothing necessarily special about international trade. There's domestic commerce too, which is exchange between producers and consumers. And international trade is just sort of the international extension of that between countries and firms and producers in one country and in consumers in other markets. So this is just because different countries have different attributes that give them an abundance of certain goods that they can share with the rest of the world. So here we just have two individuals, and they can engage in trade, which will be mutually beneficial. We'll talk about President Trump has this view that other countries are ripping the US off. That trade is not this mutually beneficial thing, but there's one country that's a winner and another country that's a loser. But economists don't think about trade that way. If producers are producing eggs and I want to purchase eggs, they're going to win and I'm going to win. It's sort of a positive-sum game, not this zero-sum game. And that's what this cartoon here suggests as well. This is not, this sort of idea goes way back in time. So I'll talk about one of the first economic thinkers from the Middle East. Has anyone heard of this individual before? I'm even afraid to pronounce his name. How do you pronounce it? Ibn Khaldun. Is he famous in Israel? Kind of? Okay, yeah. As famous as, anything. Okay, yep. Anyway, he had this idea way before the Scottish Enlightenment, way before Adam Smith, that, humans must cooperate in their, well, first of all, the first line, individuals cannot obtain for themselves the necessities of life. If we were self-sufficient as individuals and we had to make our own things, our own food, our own clothing, our own houses, it would be very inefficient. We'd be very poor. It's because people specialize in certain occupations. Someone, had to squeeze that orange juice this morning. Okay, maybe not. Powder and water. Okay, someone had to produce the powder and mix it. Okay, we could do that ourselves, but it wouldn't quite be as good. And so, with this cooperation of the group of human beings satisfies the needs of a number of many more than themselves. So just this idea of cooperation. But economists sort of look more to Adam Smith as being sort of the key person that talked about the division of labor and international trade. Of course, he was the Scottish philosopher that taught at the University of Glasgow and wrote the book, The Wealth of Nations. And he said, you can't make everything you want for yourself. You have to trade for it. And trade is a way of just making ourselves better off. We'll specialize in some activity from which we'll earn an income, and then we'll spread that income across the various items that other people are producing, and we'll be better off as a result. Why does Adam Smith say this? The first sentence of his book, The Wealth of Nations, the very first sentence makes this point. Have you read any Adam Smith? Okay, good. So we're just going to read one sentence, the very first sentence of the book, but we have to translate it into modern language because it's a little bit archaic. The annual labor of every nation is the fund. What does he mean by that? What is the fund? Exactly, what's the simplest way economists think about this today? GDP. That's what he's saying. The GDP of every nation, which originally supplies it with all the necessaries and conveniences of life, which it annually consumes. So GDP is the income of which we can, consume things, and which consists always either of the immediate produce of that labor. So what's the immediate produce of our labor? The stuff that we're producing. Yep. The orange juice, such as it is. Or in what is purchased with that produce from other nations. So what is GDP? It's how much labor, how much we're producing with our labor and consuming, or also how we're exchanging some of our labor for the produce of other countries. And he has a whole section of the book. Do I need this? No. I don't think so either. Happy not to hold it. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. International trade is an important part of the division of labor, an important part of sort of what your GDP is. That's what he's saying in the very first sentence, and the whole of the book is sort of an elaboration of that idea. So what is international trade? International trade is the exchange of exports for imports. The two go hand in hand. You cannot import most countries without exporting. So that's that exchange notion. Exports are the necessary cost of acquiring imports. So actually economists think, there's something called mercantilism, which Adam Smith was sort of writing against. And mercantilism was imports are bad, exports are good. Because exports, that's requiring your production, your labor, that's employing people. Imports just detract from that. Adam Smith turned that on his head. He said, actually, imports are the benefit. Imports are the things you get to consume and buy. And the problem is other countries are crass enough to demand payment for what they're going to sell you, and so you have to export to them. If they're going to sell to you, you have to export to them. Is there any country that can import without exporting? Pardon me? Unless you rely on donations and money. And what country early in its history relied on donations to fund its imports? Israel. In fact, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was something known as the import surplus. Imports were about 15% of GDP. Exports were like 5% of GDP or less. How could you do that? It was aid from Western Europe or the United States. In other words, Israel got by in its early decades by foreign aid. And it was only through the realization that, guess what? You can't live forever on that aid. That aid is going to be curtailed at some point. And if you want to maintain that level of imports and your standard of living with all the things you're buying, what do you have to do? You have to export. And so that's what Israel started doing in the 1960s, is changing its policy to focus on exports. That's the way you can afford those imports. So imports are the gain. You get more varieties of things, lower cost. You get to import better technology. And trade is mutually beneficial, not a zero-sum game. I should have done this for Israel going way back, but I couldn't get the data quick enough. This is New Zealand. And its foreign trade is a share of GDP. So notice that trade is about 25, 30, 35% of GDP. And blue is exports, orange is imports, and the two sort of go hand in hand. And so there's all sorts of trade theories about why this happens and all that sort of stuff, which is a lot of fun, but we won't get into it. But just, if New Zealand wants to import 20, 25% of GDP, it's got to export about 20 to 25% of its GDP. So there are countries, the US has a big trade imbalance. We can talk about that later if you're interested, but that tends to be more anomalous. That's unusual situation. And most countries have to have roughly balanced trade. So orange juice, we sort of talked about how, that. How about coffee? Did everyone have some coffee this morning? Okay, that's very big. Does Israel grow coffee? A little bit, okay. But if we didn't have trade, it would be very scarce, and the price would be very high because you have to ration that small amount. And so the US does not produce any coffee whatsoever. But as you probably know, Americans are big coffee drinkers. And so we source it from all sorts of countries around the world. Bananas. I didn't see any bananas at breakfast. Did I miss them? No? Pardon me? You do grow bananas. But is it a big item in Israel? Do people like bananas? So they just decide not to serve it for us this morning? Okay, I missed it because I usually have a banana every morning. And once again, the United States doesn't produce any bananas, but we consume a lot of bananas. How can you consume something you don't produce? You trade for it. You import it. You don't have to produce stuff for yourself. And so it's mainly Central America that we get our bananas, but of course there's Asia as well. And of course, variety. One of the, trade is not just allowing us to have more of stuff, it allows us to have more different stuff. Varieties of fruits and vegetables, varieties of manufactured products, all sorts of semiconductors, different types of semiconductors for different types of applications are produced by different countries around the world. So here's Israel. Yes?
Yes, I think we don't import them. We grow them here, just grow them here, but we don't. In summer, you don't have bananas.
Okay.
Just in winter. Yeah. So there are lots of fruits you can't consume in summer. For instance, strawberries, bananas.
So sometimes you won't have bananas, but just no bananas.
No mangoes, no strawberries, and only bananas.
And
No exotic fruits.
yeah, because does that mean the government's not allowing them in?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
There's a strong lobby here.
Yes, okay. So in the US, we have a similar thing, except for, it used to be that
We'd have the same thing as Israel, where you'd have seasonal produce. Seasonal. So if it's in season, it's around because we've produced it, but then we would go for like 6 months of the year with no tomatoes. That doesn't happen anymore.
So you're in the end of the banana season.
Bananas, end of strawberries, so we might have strawberries and bananas.
Well, see, that's from a U.S. perspective, that's where we were 30, 40 years ago. We're not that anymore because we allow the stuff in. Okay, yeah. Yeah, you can freeze some things, but so this idea of seasonality is just not an issue in the U.S. anymore. Every day of the year, we expect our grocery stores to have bananas. We expect them to have tomatoes. We expect them to have lettuce. Because if we don't make it, if it's not in season, we're able to import it. So that gets the abundance and variety point. So here's Israel. And you can take a look at, on the left-hand side, what it is that Israel exports. On the right-hand side is who are your big trading partners. So a lot of exports go to the United States, a lot to Western Europe, and you can see integrated circuits and diamonds are pretty big with some petroleum, a lot of different manufactured goods, variety of things.
Just secondhand, for example, the diamonds. We don't produce diamonds.
You don't find,
oh, you refine them.
Yeah.
Ah, that's an important point. So you're importing the diamonds and adding its value.
Second, third hand.
Second, third hand, yes.
Well, actually, see that with China in some cases too, what they're doing. Here's the import side. Imports on the left, and then the countries from which you're importing goods on the right. If you're interested in this, there's something called the Atlas of Economic Complexity, and you can Google it, and every country they'll have these charts, and they'll go back in time. You can sort of look at things. One difference, though, look at the exports and look at the imports. What do you see about the squares? They're different, yes. And you're right, the size. Someone said, who said small? Yes. So what is that indicating? And this is a general pattern across all.
Specialize in certain things and then you can buy everything.
Exactly. So countries' exports tend to be sort of concentrated in a few goods or a few commodities. And imports are very diverse because you're importing a little bit of everything. And that's sort of the way we as individuals function too. There's an analogy between countries and individuals. I'm a teacher. So what do I do most days? I teach. I don't do fishing. I don't do all sorts of other things. I do one thing. But then from the income that I earn, I buy a lot of different things, a lot of little things. And this country is doing the same thing. And that's why Adam Smith's view of trade and individuals is sort of, it works very well between countries and individuals in terms of how you think about things. So you can see there are a lot of different manufactured goods. Obviously, cars is a big one. But then, all those things are chopped up into smaller blocks because you're importing a little bit of this, that, and the other thing. One of the more sophisticated products that is we have due to international trade is the iPhone. How many of you have an iPhone? How many of you are Android users? I'm surprised. I'm an Android person too. I'm not that I'm anti-Apple, but I sort of, want to stay away from that a bit. What does it say on the back of iPhones? Without looking. Where does it say it's made? Pardon me? Yes, it doesn't say, usually products will say made in X. It does not say that. It says designed in California and assembled in China, because it's not really made anywhere. So here is the value chain of all these countries that are contributing to things. First of all, here are all the parts of an iPhone. All the parts are not made in China. They're made all over the place. And so let's see. So flash memory in Korea, the wireless charging receiver in the US, the Wi-Fi module in China, the microcontroller in Switzerland, the display port in the Netherlands, the camera in Japan, other parts in Japan, some parts display in South Korea. So a lot of different countries are contributing to making this product. And here's the cost of all these inputs. This is sort of an interesting one. So first of all, the factory gate price when it comes out from China is about $200. $80 is inputs from Korea. 16 from Germany, some from France, from Japan. That might be a little bit low. The assembly in China is adding $6 of value. The US is contributing about $24 that's exporting to China to be put into an iPhone. It's assembled in China, then comes to the US and is sold for $300, or retail $600. Apple's getting $270 of that, just as profits for overhead. That's the design services. But here's where trade statistics can be a little bit misleading. And a lot of people think the US has a big trade deficit with China. When this comes from China, it's recorded as an import of almost $200 coming from China. How much is the US exporting to China to make this? $24. So we're exporting $24, but we're importing something for $200. But is China keeping that difference? No, it's all flowing back to these other countries. How much is China keeping of this? $7. So we're exporting $24 to China. They're getting $7 in terms of the assembly, and that's being sold for $600 or so. So a lot of manufactured products are very complex products that are using parts from all over the world, and just because it's coming from one last country, one last place, doesn't mean that's really where it's made, or that most of the value is staying from that country there. The same thing is true with the US and Mexico in our trade in automobiles. We import a lot of automobiles from Mexico. Are they all Mexican cars? No, because the parts are coming from the US, Japan, Canada, and elsewhere. There's a hand over here.
Laws apply to things that are assembled in different places?
No. Yes, we could have, in fact, we now, thanks to President Trump, have now started imposing tariffs on these imports of iPhones from China. During his first term, the U.S. imposed tariffs on about half of our imports from China and exempted consumer electronics. So these were not subject to tariffs back in his first term, but now they are. So yes. Now, the U.S. can't impose tariffs on all those inputs because that's trade between, say, Korea and China. And China would not have tariffs on those things because it wants cheap inputs so it can be very cost competitive on the output side. So the U.S. could impose tariffs on the final product. Okay, so just trying to give you a little bit of a sense for what trade is about in terms of different commodities and how countries specialize. There are a lot of arguments against trade that you've commonly heard. In fact, before putting this up, I should have asked you. Let me see if I can't erase that, right? I can't rewind. What would be arguments against trade?
Even if it's like seasonal, okay, but then if you have to have it every day of the year, it means you're importing it from various places and it's not maybe good for the economy.
Okay, so climate change, we'll deal with that a little bit later. Yeah.
Let's make the world class poor.
Make the,
World class.
okay, poor?
Yeah.
Yep.
It can be used by other countries to, I guess, kind of play around with your industries. Like if you have China
Subsidizing their
subsidize
industries.
their car industry, and then and then cars in the U.S. are you can't get a car in the U.S. You can only get a Chinese car, and then they can drive up prices when all of your industries.
Yep, so they can, yep, so we'll talk about that too. Yep.
We can maybe lose jobs in our industries because maybe some countries are doing a better job on making their items cheaper, and then we'll buy it from them because it will be cheaper, and we can lose the jobs in the
Losing jobs, yep. Any other thoughts? Yep.
Human rights?
Human rights, so we're going to be importing from countries that don't treat labor very well.
Yes.
There's a hand over here.
Huge important for political relationships between countries. If we have a bad relationship with a country that brought us something that is very important, so
the direct trade towards more friendly countries. or something
Yeah,
like
because
that.
if you increase China's GDP, maybe you will increase their military force.
Right, yep. National security. Security.
Yeah.
Security, okay. So
we'll talk about some of those. A lot of them were sort of non-economic things, but we'll get to them as well. But here are some common statements made in the U.S. about why we shouldn't be so open to trade. First one, it came up a little bit. It'll make us poorer. The U.S. is a high-wage country. We're going to be importing a lot of products that are produced elsewhere where labor's costs a lot less. It's going to drive down prices, drive down our profits, drive down our wages too. So this race to the bottom idea. We'll lose good jobs. We'll lose manufacturing industries. There's this view in the US, we've sort of deindustrialized, we've become a service economy. Now we can't produce things and the country needs to produce them. President Trump makes that point, and then we'll lose sovereignty and things like that. So let's address the first one. So the counterpoint would be, actually it doesn't make us poor, it makes us more efficient and hence richer. And this is where it's important to go back to Adam Smith, because it gets to why trade actually helps the wealth of nations and doesn't detract from the wealth of nations. So there's an American economist, Paul Krugman. Has anyone heard of him? Okay. New York Times columnist until recently. He said, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it is almost everything. Productivity. That's also what Adam Smith put in the centerpiece of the Wealth of Nations when he talked about the division of labor and the efficiency of labor. And here's why it's important. And this is, when I show this to my class, I call this the most important graph or chart in all of economics. How long is that? You spent a lot of time reading Adam Smith. How thick is Adam Smith? Like this thick? Guess what? That's the Wealth of Nations right there. What is he saying? So on this axis here, we have labor productivity, the efficiency of your labor, as a percent of the U.S. So U.S. is 100 up to 120. And this axis, what do we hear? Relative wages. How high is your income relative to the U.S.? The U.S. once again based at 100. And what do you notice about this chart? Almost linear. Not perfectly. Nothing's perfect. Some that are off the line a bit, but they sort of follow that 45-degree line, which tells you what? What's the conclusion you would draw?
Better wages,
The more productive you are, the better wages, the richer you're going to be.
So let's say you are Yugoslavia, which actually isn't a country anymore. So let's go to Panama or Colombia or Indonesia or Thailand down there. They're at about 20 to 30% of US per capita income. Labor is about 20 to 30% as efficient as labor in the United States. If you are the leader of those countries and you say, we want to grow, we want to become richer, what's the policy implication that comes out of this chart?
For example, Colombia needs to produce some stuff, and Israel needs to produce high tech. If you focus on what you're actually good at, your wages will be higher, your country will be richer.
That's very well put. And I would just make it even simpler and say, you just have to worry about your efficiency, your productivity. If your labor becomes more productive,
incomes will go up. How do you become more productive? Specialize. What sort of policies might help your labor force become more productive? Education. Entrepreneurship. New businesses. Capital accumulation. You want buildings and equipment and things like that, so you want to encourage that, not discourage it. Actually, it turns out, there's no one thing that's embodied in productivity, but there are a lot of things, and you want to encourage those things. You don't want to suppress those things. One thing that will encourage productivity is competition, rivalry, and obviously being open to trade. Why would openness to trade have anything to do with your efficiency?
Competing with my local markets, I don't need to be competitive. If I only create strawberries in Israel, I just need to compete with the guy next to me that's trading. But if I'm competing for Colombia, I need to be the best at it. And if I'm not good, I will get shut down.
Yes, and it's no coincidence that most countries' export sectors are some of the most efficient producers in the country because they have to beat the world competition. So the bigger your export sector is, not only can you afford more imports, but you are going to be more efficient. And for any small economy, you have to import technology. You have to import the best capital equipment. And so that's going to make you more productive. So you need trade to help you do that. But this is The Wealth of Nations, that book, in one chart in some sense. It doesn't get into all the reasons behind it. And there's a lot of stuff behind it that's really interesting. What is this chart? This chart is from the United States and it has two lines. Average hourly productivity, which is the sort of yellow line since 1970, and average hourly compensation. So when we looked at this, we said, gosh, they're pretty highly correlated. They sort of go together. What's going on here? They're pretty highly correlated. They sort of go together. As productivity rises, that means labor's more efficient. Labor's going to earn a higher income as a result because basically you're paid your productivity. And if there's a productivity slowdown, as there was, and you can see it here, let's see. Well, you can't see it here so much, but when productivity slows down, wage growth is going to slow down. When productivity growth picks up, wage growth will pick up. Yeah.
I try to put this thought into words, but in this, what you're saying, can it cause trouble in human rights? Like, I'm thinking about Africa, for instance, where they have enough problem with this child labor and whatever. But if what you're saying is right, they can be like, okay, you can't just work 8 hours a day. We want to be more productive. You have to work 16 hours a day, 17 hours a day.
So which countries have the longest work days or work years?
Israel.
Okay, very hard working here.
China.
It tends to be, so I don't have the chart, I can show it to you. If you look at average hours worked per year over the past century or so, it's gone one way down. And that's because, talk about a lot of effort and work, agriculture. So as we've transitioned away from agriculture, where it's really not quite 24/7, but it's a lot, to manufacturing jobs and others, there's a start and a stop to work. So actually, as we become richer, we're working a lot less than we did in the past.
We can't have every country in the world working in high tech. Like I'm saying, someone needs to pick those oranges or like peel the nuts. You know what I'm saying?
Yep. And so
import technology.
So you can substitute technology for some of that stuff. So in the U.S., there's a big debate about immigration. So we're quickly.
Noah, for example.
Let me just give you a specific example about human rights and child labor in Vietnam. So Vietnam was a closed economy until the early 1990s. And they opened up and they liberalized and they allowed prices to move. And the price of rice went way up because they had suppressed the price of rice because they wanted to keep it cheap for consumers. Is a low price of rice good for consumers? Sort of, except what's the problem with artificially keeping down the price of rice? Then there's less incentive to produce it. And then you're very poor because for all that work to produce rice, you're not going to get much of a return. it turns out during that period when people were very poor and when agriculture was very inefficient in Vietnam, parents had their kids working in the fields picking rice because they're so poor, they needed that extra labor. When the price of rice went up, they uncapped that price. What happened? There's a great incentive to produce more rice. The income of rural households, which tend to be the poorest, went way up. What did the parents do with their children? They sent them to school. Because now they didn't need their labor to make it by. They could be more than subsistence because the price was higher, and they wanted their children to have a better life than they've had themselves. So what tends to happen is rising incomes, parents will get their kids out of the fields working into school so they'll have a better life. So there are mechanisms so that as countries grow, they just don't work more and put more child labor into the production, but it's exactly the opposite. As you become richer, you can have more leisure and get your kids out of the fields, if you will. So with Africa in particular, that would be the hope, that if they can get political stability and provide some more economic freedom, that they'll be on a better road to higher wealth, and some of these problems will ease, one would hope. I guess that would be the answer I'd give. Okay, so if in the US, if in Israel, if in these countries you want wages to go up, what does this suggest has to happen? You have to increase productivity. So that dovetails exactly with what we were just talking about. But here's the view among those who think that the problem is you can't have high-wage countries and low-wage countries competing, because the low-wage countries, will have a cost advantage. They'll undercut those high-wage countries, and what you'll do is you'll bring down the wage levels and the standards of living of the rich countries when they interact in this way. And this is called the race to the bottom, and it's this view that in the US, Walmart and Safeway are just going to lead to, as you said, you have to work more for a lower wage to be more competitive. That's what the market economy does. So the question is this the way the international market works? Is this the way the world is? So I want to show you a series of sort of what I'd call pre-globalization and post-globalization distributions of world income. So this is the worldwide wage pool, if you will, in 1980. The height of the bar indicates GDP per capita. The width of the bar indicates how big your population is. So which were the two biggest countries in the world? And they are today too. India and China. Were they rich or poor back in 1980? Very poor. Where's the US? The US is over there, and then we have Western Europe, and then Latin American countries, and then these two large Asian countries, very poor. If these were cylinders of water, like these cups here, these countries were cylinders of water, and they weren't really engaged with one another, what would happen if you pulled those cylinders up? Do you get the analogy I'm trying to... Okay, these are all cylinders.
Trickle down.
What's going to happen?
It would trickle down.
Exactly. So what's going to happen to the US? All that high income is going to slosh down, and who's going to... Are there going to be winners and losers? Yes. Is it positive? Will they both benefit? No.
Technically.
And who would benefit the most?
The lower.
India and China. And then what's going to be the wage level in the world? It's going to be flat. It's going to be low and flat. Okay? We'll all be at the same wage level. So is that the way the world works? Okay? Yes?
In America it goes up and it's still
Okay, so let's fast forward 20 years. 20 years, when trade really explodes. And this is the way it looks. So what's happened? Did the US get poorer?
Like they not poor, but it's more poor than it was in the start.
Everybody's better off.
Everyone's better off. Now, it turns out there's some Latin American countries there. They had a debt crisis. Things didn't work out so well for them. Mexico, Brazil, they didn't grow very much. But the US and Western Europe and Japan, did they do better? Yep. Why would they do better despite the fact there's more competition?
buy more stuff.
Sort of, but what have we just said determines your relative income or your real income? Your productivity. So why did this go up? They became more productive. Why did they go up? They became more productive. The two big ones, of course, are productivity is really low in these countries, and it got better. And what else do you notice about India and China? They switched places. Why did they switch places? Between 1980 and 2000. Nailed it. Have you heard of Deng Xiaoping? He revolutionized China. He revolutionized the world. So he declared reform and opening in 1978-79. So that's an important date. He's beginning to open up in the late 1970s. When did India open up? 1991. That's when they began the switch, 1991. So what did China have? A 10-year head start to opening up. What, if you're a really poor country, why do you get this big burst of growth? You have a lot of room to grow. And if you just buy better technology, you have the same labor, but it's going to be more efficient because you have better technology. Boom! You get that burst. Will China overtake the US?
No, never.
Why not never?
For real, okay.
But before, remember what we were talking about? The rich will get poor and the poor will get richer and it'll be flat. What would be the real consequence of true openness and globalization? Everyone will sort of match the US. And so it's a big issue. There's something called the middle income trap. Maybe China, there's a limit to how much it can do that, because if you don't have freedom, you're not really going to become efficient in all these sectors. And so, and they're already starting to slow down a bit, even though they're only part of the way there. Actually, let's fast forward. So this is to 2000, but we're much later. So let's have this every 10 years from 1970. And this is what it looks like. And so you can see China between 70 and 2020, big increase. But the US also a very big increase. And so you can see just about everyone's moving up. But let's get back to this question about China for a moment. Why will China, in my view, in your lifetime, never overtake the US in terms of per capita income? I'll make that as a bold claim. They will never overtake the US in terms of per capita income.
Well, you made the point about middle income trap, where when salaries become higher in China, it's harder to produce in cheap like they did with a lot of industries. So a lot of they'll have to give up some of their industries because they become less efficient.
Yep. Certainly. Yep.
The economy is still very planned. So there's a 5-year plan. There's no way with a communist government, and it's still quite communist, to reach its full potential because it will always be limited by land, by programs. The Chinese people will not be able to specialize as much.
Okay, so they still have planning which will hold them back?
Maybe because the US head start, like we said with India and China, US has much more head start.
Yeah, and what is the US doing to the technological frontier?
Innovates.
It's innovating. So what's happening then? It's always moving up. And China's always trying to catch up. And so if China is going to overtake the US, what does it have to do?
And they're going to be less and less efficient.
So the US will not become less efficient, but it's just the growth will not be there. And China will have better technology than the US. So here's the analogy that I would use. So in your collegiate studies, when you're in college, university, what is the hardest course at your university? What is that? Oh, okay, mathematics, very high advanced branch of mathematics. In the US, everyone considers it to be organic chemistry. Have you heard of this? Like, a lot of people want to become doctors, and the number one thing stopping them from being a doctor is organic chemistry. Not that bad? Okay, you're smart. Okay, well, yeah. What does your organic chemistry textbook look like? It's this thick. And it's the state of the art. This is what we know about organic chemistry. Now, if you're China and you're at a low level of productivity because you don't have the best technology, you're basically taking that book and what are you doing? You're studying it. To overtake the US, what do you have to do?
More than one like that.
You have to do better than that. You have to. Okay, you can destroy technology. Yes, we don't. There can be technological regress, but you have to write the second edition of that textbook. Now, is it hard to learn that textbook? Absolutely. How easy is it to write the next edition? Even harder, because you have to innovate and say, oh, actually, we got some things wrong in that textbook. We're going to do better. And it's very hard. If China really began to catch up to the U.S., what could the U.S. do?
Be more efficient, more smarter.
Well, also borrow their technology. If they exceed us in certain things, we take their technology too. So you'd expect to see this convergence if everything's open. Yeah, sorry.
To play a little bit of devil advocate.
Please.
Just kind of go according to Trump's logic of the war of tariffs with China. So basically, Trump says that there's no way we are providing free trade to China, but China is not providing free trade to us. China is stealing intellectual property. China is creating tariffs on us. So in one way, China is beneficial a lot, but America is actually losing the spell, losing intelligent produce. And as a result of that, China is succeeding in taking a lot of American stuff. That's kind of Trump's logic. And I'm interested to hear from you how you contradict this.
I'm not, but I'm going to talk about it tomorrow.
Don't you think that there is a problem of diminishing marginal benefits that the US will face and China will have a better opportunity to rise?
Sure. It's much easier to catch up to the frontier. And as you approach the frontier, your growth is going to slow. The problem is actually, let's go forward here. So here they are in 2019. What's happening to China's growth rate? It's already slowing. So you'd say, gosh, look at the gap between China and the US. They should still have ample room to grow really rapidly. But if they're already slowing now, that's that's worrisome from China's perspective. One country that's done incredibly well and is now overtaking Japan, it's not listed there, is South Korea. South Korea has been very innovative and now has a higher per capita income than Japan. There's another hand back there, yeah.
Where's Russia?
It's not a big population, so I'm not exactly sure. I'd have to pick that out. I wonder if is it richer than China? Probably not. Yeah, I wouldn't think so. So it's probably right to the right of China somewhere, I would think. Pardon me? Saudi Arabia, yeah, that's in there somewhere. Jobs. Okay, so the basic point, and this gets to Trump's point too, is trade a zero-sum game. Is the international economy a zero-sum game, where some countries win, some countries lose? It's more of your fate is determined by your policies that will determine what your productivity is. And let me put it this way. If U.S. productivity is growing at 3% a year, what should be happening to U.S. standards of living? If U.S. productivity is growing 3% a year, what's happening on average to U.S. standards of living? Exactly. If China is growing at 2% a year, how does that impact the U.S.? Versus if China is growing at 8 or 9% a year. In some sense, they're independent. If the U.S. is growing, if productivity is growing 3% in the U.S., it doesn't matter what's going on in China. That's determining what the standards of living are going to grow at. So obviously you can borrow from countries and things of that sort, so there's this interaction. But basically, if a country's not doing well, it's not because the world economy is sort of screwing it over in some sense. It's because there's some problem with the domestic economy in terms of productivity. That's sort of what's going on here. Jobs, that's a big issue in the US. So here's another British cartoon from their free trade era in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And it says foreign goods freely admitted, and this is a British worker, and they're worried about German goods, US goods, goods from other countries taking away jobs. So we'll lose good jobs if we open to trade. The response would be, we'll have different jobs with higher incomes because it's forcing us to adjust and forcing us to upgrade in that way. We can talk about that more later. We'll lose manufacturing industries. This is a big concern in the US. But once again, the issue for standards of living is how efficient is your labor force? So 2 countries there. Is Australia a wealthy country? Very high standard of living. How much manufacturing goes on in Australia? Not a lot, basically zero. They don't even produce cars anymore. They used to have some car industry. They don't produce cars. They're importing them. And so they're exporting something else. How about India? Is India a rich country or a poor country? Poor country, they've become a little bit richer. Do they have a lot of manufacturing? They had a lot of manufacturing. But so why are wages so low in India if they have so much manufacturing, if manufacturing is sort of a driver? So that's Indian manufacturing. So you can have a lot of manufacturing, but if it's sort of low-scale industry that's not very efficient, it doesn't really matter. You're not going to be this industrial powerhouse, and wages are not going to be very high. So they've had a very closed market for cars for many, many decades until very recently. They had one car producer domestically, the Ambassador. That's Rajasthan Motors, or I think, I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, that's the 1957 version. That's the 2011 version. What's different?
Not a lot.
Not a lot. And if you open up the hood, it wouldn't look all that different either. So what did I say earlier about competition as being a driver of productivity? If you don't face a competitive threat, why would you innovate?
You can see, for example, in phone, Nokia, when I was young, Nokia was the amazing phone that everyone wanted, but now we don't know about them anymore. And we have iPhone, but in this
Yes. How about Blackberries? Do you remember Blackberries? That's a Canadian company, I believe, and they were that was the hottest thing. With a little keyboard, and you work on your thumbs. Okay, and we just don't have it anymore. So we'll lose sovereignty or control over our country. Other countries will take us over. Capitalists will exploit us. This is almost getting to more sociology than economics. The US, for example, just stopped Nippon Steel, Japanese firm, from buying US steel. Because, we don't want Japan dictating our economy. And economists were saying, why did we stop this? Because what are they going to? They're going to bring new technology. They're bringing an infusion of capital to this large US firm that's struggling. Why is this a problem? Just because there's foreign ownership. But that's a concern. Even in the US, there's concerns about other people owning things in our industry. Yeah.
So the graphic we saw were, of course, per capita, but how about the GDP not per capita? And so, like, leveraged countries can have one another. That's also, like, it doesn't show how
Political power. Political power in some sense? Yes.
Or like
we'll talk about that.
A more powerful country.
Yes, we'll get to that in a little bit. We'll just see how we're doing here. Okay. Joan Robinson, not a very market-friendly economist, even she, from Cambridge, the UK, said the misery of being exploited by capitalists is nothing compared to the misery of not being exploited at all. That's really funny from an economist standpoint, because what is she saying? I mean, are foreign multinationals exploiting workers in North Korea?
Yes. Oh, not North Korea. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're not being exploited. That's great, right?
That means they don't have jobs.
Exactly. Yeah. How about Cuba? Are Cuban workers being exploited by American multinationals? How wealthy are the Cuban people? They're trying to leave. Okay, so what would happen to the Cuban economy, the Cuban workers, if they allowed foreign investment to come in? Would they be exploited? It depends on what you mean by exploited, but you mean bringing new technology and paying them a higher wage so they work more. That's not exploitation, so you can have a higher standard of living. Where would you rather be? Here's some open economies on the left, some closed economies on the right. And this, just make this comparison in terms of standards of living and various things. Have you read Milton Friedman, Capitalism and Freedom? I don't know if it's part of this curriculum, but what he's saying is that when you have a market economy and open and free trade, actually it's related to freedom in all sorts of dimensions that's not just standards of living. And the two sort of simultaneously cause each other. Open, free democratic societies tend to have open trade policies. And if you have more open trade policies, you're going to be wealthier and that'll push you towards political freedom. So he's saying political and economic freedom are inherently interrelated. And so it goes beyond just the economics of it. Let's talk a little bit about trade policy. So there's this, so we said international trade is the exchange of exports for imports. It's this two-way street. It's not just one-way flow. What's a country's policy on trade? I put it on a spectrum from being closed to open. Closed being, that's known as autarky, meaning no trade, to completely free trade, no tariffs or restrictions on international trade. Where is Israel on this spectrum? Okay, right in there. Guess where Israel was 30, 40 years ago? Pretty closed. Israel was very fearful of all those things, losing jobs, foreign domination of the economy. Other countries will take advantage of us and things of that sort. And you've moved to the right, and I think, is Israel prosperous because of it? Has it helped? I would think the answer would be yes. Autarky is tough. It's tough at an individual level basis. It's tough at a country basis. Here's some individuals who in the US said, we're tired of modern life. We're going to go to Montana, which is the state in the West where there not many people live. It's a lot of forest. And we're just going to avoid markets and society. And they paid the price. It's really hard to make your own clothes, get your own food without relying on others, the division of labor, as Smith said. And there's countries too. So what country is this? What peninsula is this? It's North and South Korea. There's a picture at night, a satellite picture. And can you see, where's Seoul, Korea? This is Seoul right here. What is this? Pyongyang. This is the DMZ. And then that's all of North Korea, and there's still a lot of people there, but they don't have a lot of electricity. And so lights are an indicator of how well off your people are. There's more generally, there's Japan, and you can see China as well. So, closed versus open. I'll talk a little bit about closed more, but let's talk about why do economists tend to support this idea of freer trade? In Israel, it happened because economists were advocating for freer trade. In the US, it's happened a little bit because of economists advocating it in other countries as well. And there are just 4 ways in which one can make the argument that free trade is a good idea for a country. And if you don't like one, you can pitch them out and take another one. One is the theoretical case. Have you taken a class in international trade or Econ 101, first class in economics? Okay, that's probably the case that you got there. It's, oh, we're going to draw this diagram, and diagram shows us that trade's good. Or you do comparative advantage, and you do these 4 numbers, and you say, oh, we do this calculation, boom, you can have more goods. That's a theoretical case. There's also a moral case that some people have made. There's a political case that some people have made. And then finally, there's the empirical case, is just what is the lived experience of people under closed versus open trade policies. So I briefly want to go through each of these. So Adam Smith sort of made a theoretical argument for freer trade. He made a case against import restraints, and he did so on the grounds of, made the case for freer trade on economic efficiency and national interests. You might have heard of David Ricardo. He came up with this idea of comparative advantage, which we won't go into. in this book, The Principles of Political Economy. And the message of comparative advantage is, well, there are many messages, but one is you can always compete in something. Even if you have really low productivity, you can still have a comparative advantage in certain types of goods. And what this is showing you is just, first of all, wages and productivity, and then the unit labor cost. You know, in the Philippines, this is once again benchmarked against the US. In the Philippines, wages are 18% of wages in the US. For every dollar a US worker gets, a Filipino worker gets 18 cents. How can an American worker getting paid that higher wage ever compete against someone from the Philippines? Exactly, because that American worker will produce much more. The Filipino worker, their productivity is about 18% of the US worker. So the unit cost of something is almost the same. And so it's looking at different sectors where there's an imbalance between wages and productivity. That will give the Philippines a comparative advantage in certain activities. And the same thing with those other countries. This is a diagram. If you took a class in trade, there's an old professor of mine from Burma who taught us this diagram. Don't worry about the diagram. Not going to go over it. Just showing you that this is how economists will talk about trade. But I went to an art gallery in Buenos Aires and I saw this painting. What did this remind me of? Well, everything reminds me of trade. So I thought, gee, this diagram here, whoops. This sort of looks like that diagram. Indifference curves. Did you ever do indifference curves in economics? Okay, so anyway, so that's the theoretical. Here's the problem with theory. I could, if I had a blackboard, I could do some equations and say, boom, proof, free trade's best. But there's a problem with theory. It's often asserted by the ill-informed or wrongly taught that free trade is best. It says that it doesn't say that. Theory doesn't say that. It says given under certain assumptions it is best. So for me to write down that model, that diagram, or do some equations, I'm making assumptions. Well, what if you change the assumptions? Will you change the conclusion? Probably. So theory is, so I wrote this whole book on the intellectual history of free trade and all the arguments in theory about why free trade may not work. And there are a lot of assumptions you can change to make free trade not work. So if you want to say, for Israel, should Israel's trade policy be open or closed? Do you want to make a theoretical argument? Maybe, maybe not, because theory is sort of a weak guide here. So here's some exceptions that one can think about in terms of the theory of trade. So countries with market power, what does that mean? Let me put it starkly. So, yes?
Monopolies in the world.
If they have monopolies in the market, should the Arab countries pursue free trade? What is their major export? Oil. So does that mean they should price it at marginal cost, have maximize exports, maximize imports? No. If they restrict their exports of oil, what happens to the world price? It goes up, and maybe it's like a monopolist. If you restrict your output and you raise the price, you'll be better off with those profits. And so that is why OPEC sometimes says we're going to cut oil production. That's not sort of letting the market rip. That's determining, we're trying to maximize how much rents we're extracting from the rest of the world. So that means you don't necessarily want a policy of free trade. So that's a theoretical exception. If a country has market power and can act as a monopolist with respect to other countries, it may not want pure free trade for those particular goods. Another one which came up a bit earlier, and we'll talk about later tomorrow too, national defense. So Adam Smith was not a dogmatic advocate of free trade. In fact, in The Wealth of Nations, he said, defense is more important than opulence. Opulence meaning GDP. Defense is more important than GDP. The first mission of any government is to protect its citizens. And if you have to sacrifice some GDP to achieve that, you sort of have to do that. So then that opens up a huge, what in the US we would call a can of worms, meaning where do you draw the line? How much defense is enough? And can you do a diagram and determine that? No. Can you do the theory and do that? No. It's a judgment call. But that's the point here. So in the US, this comes up with respect to semiconductors. Are semiconductors an important commodity in today's world? Absolutely. Where are most semiconductors manufactured? Two countries, Taiwan and, well, they produce the equipment that produces semiconductors. South Korea. So what do we have here? So these are different colors. First of all, this is the US. We have these massive semiconductor firms, but notice they're mainly green. What is green? IDM, independent design manufacturing. In other words, they design chips, but they don't actually make them. They come up with the blueprints and they send it to another firm to actually manufacture. What is manufacturing? That's the foundries. That's Taiwan and Samsung in South Korea. What's sort of the geopolitical import of the world putting almost all of its semiconductor production into two countries, Taiwan and South Korea? They're very competitive with one another. And there's some other firms. So it's not so much a monopoly. Say that again. No, don't say that again. That's you nailed it though, right? Okay, so what's the threat against Taiwan? What's the threat against South Korea? North Korea. North Korea has nuclear weapons, and it's like minutes away. So during COVID, it became very expensive to buy an automobile. I don't know if it was true here too, because the supply of the most basic, simple, non-thinking chips were in short supply, and you need a whole car, thousands of dollars of parts. You don't have that one $5 semiconductor chip, the car doesn't work. So from the world economy standpoint, putting all the production in these two countries that are geopolitically very risky areas is a little bit dicey. So the idea behind the CHIPS Act in the US, which President Trump just said is terrible, even though I suspect if Biden hadn't endorsed it, he might have thought it was a good thing, was we're going to spend some money to make sure we can produce chips in the US too. We're not going to be able to reshore the whole thing, but it's important for our economic security to have some backup supply here. So that's sort of, if you want to put that in a good way, you'd say, well, Adam Smith said defense is more important than opulence. This is not efficient. We're spending money on it, but it's sort of a prudential thing to do to avoid a catastrophe if something happens to those two countries. Domestic income distribution and national identity. This became an issue between the US and Canada. Canada was afraid the US is just going to dominate us. And we have these Canadian periodicals and films and things we don't want to lose. We don't want to lose our culture if we're just swamped by the US. So there's some protections for Canadian culture and identity in the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement. But this has always been a concern too. But there are domestic policy instruments that you can do to, if there's certain groups that are going to be adversely affected, you can compensate them. It's not so much an argument against trade, it's saying you need other complementary policies to help out with this sort of adjustment. So that's those are some of the exceptions. So we talked about the theoretical case. There's a pretty strong theoretical case, but it hinges a little bit on the assumptions. And if you want to change some of those assumptions, you can get different policy results. So I'm big on theory, but there's a limit to how much you can sort of push that. The moral case. Now, I'm an economist, so we don't talk about morality so much, but some people like to. Jeremy Bentham, a philosopher, said natural rights, that we'd have this natural right to trade. He called natural rights nonsense upon stilts. But there are other economists, sort of libertarian economists, will say, no, actually, we do have a right to have contracts with people in other countries and trade. John Stuart Mill thought a little bit differently. Have you ever read On Liberty? Okay, it's a wonderful little essay, but he says in there, he was a big advocate of free trade. He was an economist, but he said, the doctrine of free trade rests on grounds different from, though equally solid with, the principle of liberty. That it's not, you don't have a natural right to engage in trade or anything like that. It's not part of liberty because it's a state function. But he said, the principle of individual liberty is not involved in the doctrine of free trade. You can disagree with that, but that was sort of his view. So you can't sort of assert, a country ought to have a policy of free trade because that's the right policy from a standpoint of liberty. The political case is setting aside the economics just for a moment, there's a way that countries can peacefully cooperate with one another. In fact, if you get countries that have extensive economic engagement with one another, they're more likely to become, pardon me? They become dependent on each other. And they don't go to war with each other because, you know, if Greenland will sell the US some minerals, the US doesn't have to take over Greenland. Because trade is a substitute for political control. To do what?
If to buy this stuff and not take it.
Are you sure? It takes a lot of military equipment to go take something too. War is a very costly way of acquiring things. I think it's a lot cheaper just to write a check and buy them that way. But anyway, oops, lost this here. So this is Montesquieu. Okay, so he wrote Spirit of the Laws, and he said the natural effect of commerce is to bring peace. So you might want to engage in, even if there wasn't big economic gains, sometimes you want agreements with other countries to trade because it's a way of sealing cooperation between them. Richard Cobden, who was a British citizen in the early 1900s, early 19th century, saw the same thing. He said it will unite us in bonds of eternal peace if we have free trade with one another. And I was always a little bit skeptical. He came up with this idea of having an agreement between the UK, Britain, and France. It's called the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty in 1860 to establish freer trade so that France and Britain would trade more with one another. And he said this will help bring these countries together so they won't fight wars. Have Britain and France fought wars before? Actually, if you Google Anglo-French wars, this is what you get. The first one is in 1109. And it goes from 1109 to 1113, then from 1116 to 1119, then 1123 to 1135. So the 1100s, the 1200s, the 1300s, 1400s, the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1700s. In fact, there are just a few years where they're not fighting. They're always fighting. And then what happens? After 1802, there's the Napoleonic Wars. That ends in 1815. In 1860, there's the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty. How many times have Britain and France fought since 1860? Well, that's exactly why we got the EU. Okay, because then the problem shifts to Germany, and then all these European wars, the EU, in some sense, it's a free trade agreement among Western European countries, then moving into Eastern Europe, but it's also a peace pact, saying we don't want to fight anymore, we're going to engage in commerce, we'll be richer, you don't have to take someone's stuff, you can trade for it, and we'll be better off. This has also infused the US idea of free trade as well. Has anyone heard of this person? Amazing. One person, because you ask most Americans, they would have no idea. This is the longest serving Secretary of State in US history. During the 1930s, Cordell Hull, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1945, helped create the United Nations, helped bring countries together in something known as the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And he was scarred by World War I, and he said, the reason why we had this World War in 1914 is because there are a lot of trade frictions between countries, and if we can get countries trading peaceably with one another, we will bring countries together peacefully. And so that's just a representative statement of his. And he moved the US in the direction of more freer trade. And NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, was in some sense a US peace pact with Mexico. We'd always had antagonistic relations. We never got along very well. And we brought them into a free trade agreement, or actually they wanted to join, and until recently, we've gotten along fairly well. So there is something to this idea that you can diffuse political conflicts by having mutual commerce and understanding and interaction with one another. But we know we live in a dangerous world, so there's some pushback against this. So this is from the Financial Times, why trade couldn't buy the peace. So where's the big exception to this idea that the more you trade with them, the more friendly you'll be? China. So the US helps bring China into the WTO. We give them trade concessions. We sort of get them to open up as well. And we've just sort of reinforced an old status quo where the Communist Party is really dominant. So that's a big problem for the whole world. And now we see that, as we'll talk about tomorrow, some of the tensions that result from that. So this idea, so free trade has not made us free. Another article in the Financial Times. Is this the end of peace through trade? This is Paul Krugman again saying, so it's not exactly the end, but the doctrine has lost a lot of force. So sort of this uphill battle. But there are other articles in the Financial Times where they say the West shouldn't give up on gentle commerce just yet. Okay, this idea that, yes?
Can you give an example of peace through trade in the Middle East? That's no, but before the other. This is like, the golden ticket of the examples.
I don't know the examples that well. I mean, actually, the U.S. has pursued a number of free trade agreements with Oman, Morocco, Jordan. I think we have a free trade agreement. We have one with Israel, of course, too. So regardless of whether they've actually worked, that was a motivating force for those agreements, in some sense, that we'll help raise standards of living. And if you do that through this mutually beneficial commerce, you can avoid some political problems down the road.
Same thinking.
I was thinking about it as well, but like for instance that Israel provides jobs for people from
it's a win-win situation, yeah.
And still providing.
But it's not just the permits. It's not just the permits to work in Israel and things like that. It's also the actual trade with agriculture and the Gaza Strip, a lot of vegetables. Right?
So
it's not just
the LNG, I think we supply 70% of the gas to Egypt, then water to Jordan. So it doesn't procure peace, but it does make them not want to shoot us that often.
But you're not talking about trade, just talking about us giving them something.
No, we're selling them.
It's money.
What Israel trying to do right now with southern Syria is actually create peace through through obviously security and economic force with the Jews in southern Syria. So essentially, we would supply them, with jobs, and we'd supply them with, they'd give us their, man force, and they'd come and work in Israel and do take over some of the jobs of the Palestinians, that they don't own anymore. And in exchange, we would have some sort of proxy in southern Syria that will be a barrier between us and the evil Syrians.
Let's go to the big example we were just talking about, where we said it didn't work. China. Why doesn't China just take Taiwan right now? The U.S. probably wouldn't stand in the way. Why don't they just do it? Because what? Ah. Would there be a cost to China to doing that?
They saw what the world do to Russia, and they said maybe the world do the same in China.
Exactly. So that's where commercial interdependence can be a deterrent to war, because you realize you're going to give up something big if you deviate from norms and invade another country. So the one hope is that Xi Jinping knows that his economy is going to take a big hit if he tries to take Taiwan. Because even if the U.S. doesn't come in and help defend Taiwan, there's going to be sanctions, interruption in trade, standards of living in China will fall.
I don't know if more than China depends on the world, but
well, it's a two-way street.
Can you punish China? Can you boycott them?
Absolutely.
We saw what happened with Russia and Ukraine, and how the prices of everything went up because of the wheat and all those stuff. And I think China is even more.
You can see the same thing about Europe when this war of Russia started. Something like 40 or 50% of the gasoline in Europe, it was from Russia. And this war turned that all the electricity got going to be more and more efficiently in the end of the day, because they changed a lot of stuff. That they have something I call PRE,
how to תעזרו לי עם האנגלית, להחליף את החשמל שמבוסס על הגז הרוסי וכל מה שקשור לאנרגיות מתחדשות. והם עשו יותר
Well, we continue this at lunch because it's a great discussion about, and this is exactly Montesquieu's point, whether commercial interdependence maybe doesn't foster good relations, but it creates a bond that if you break that, you're going to suffer as a result. And you take that into your calculations. It doesn't mean that you're never going to opt for war, but that the cost of war may be higher because you're going to forego something. And yes, we are dependent on China very much, but China also depends on those markets. Because you can imagine what's going to happen to their unemployment rate when they're cut off from sending things, and Vietnam is just going to take over a lot of the production from them. So we have alternative sources of supply. It's going to hurt them very much, but we'll carry on this debate. What time do we have to wrap up?
in 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. I want to stop, go to this last one, the empirical case for trade. That's the one I think that just makes sense. Like, let's look at what happens when countries open to trade, or look at what happens when countries close to trade, and see what happens and determine whether the outcome is good or bad. So this is just an empirical case. So there's 2 ways of doing it. Well, lived experience. This is Boris Yeltsin, who was one of the first leaders of Russia after the collapse of communism. He's visiting George W. Bush in Houston, Texas, and going for the first time to a grocery store. And he said, talk about seasonal produce and all that. He wrote in his memoirs that this was a searing experience for him, to see the abundance that was utterly lacking in the old Soviet Union, and thinking we had suffered in the Soviet Union decade after decade of deprivation that's completely unnecessary because they didn't have market forces and trade to allow this to happen. This is another lived experience. Why were Russians initially protesting the invasion of Ukraine? Well, there's a New York Times report from someone who said the Russian people will only get poor because we depend on international trade so much. They knew they were going to get hit with sanctions. They knew they were going to become an international pariah. And regardless of how they thought about Ukraine, they knew they were going to get poor. And so unfortunately, we don't see any protests anymore because there's been a crackdown, but initially there were protests. We saw North Korea. In terms of empirical evidence, practical evidence, there's quantitative evidence and historical evidence. So the quantitative is, I talked about theory. Well, what most economists do now is econometrics, that is look at data. So just look at the data, and a colleague of mine, Jim Fire, did this paper, very important paper, Trade and Income, and it's the best, most sophisticated study on whether more trade leads to higher income. And this is what he found, a 1% increase in trade increases GDP by 0.5%. So anything you can do to boost your trade share, you're going to boost your income through all the channels we've been talking about before. Just rock solid statistical evidence from the post-war period. Historical case studies. Oh, and you can trust that a lot more than theory. That's not theory. That's just saying, what does the world tell us in terms of GDP and trade? Historical case studies. We can see countries opening and closing over time in history. And I started an economic historian, so I like some of these. Some of these are old from the 1800s. Some are more recent. So the US actually had this embargo, complete embargo on trade between 1807 and 1809. The question is, did that work out well for the US? Just shutting off trade, all of trade for a year and a half. No, that's the bottom line. It was terrible for the US economy, suffered a 5% loss of GDP in 1 year. That's like a major recession. It's almost a Great Depression. It didn't work out so well. Japan was under autarky. They didn't trade. The shoguns were in charge. And, and the US, against their will, forced Japan to open up to trade. And they didn't want to do it. Was it good for Japan? Well, very good statistical studies show that their GDP went up 8 to 9% just as a result of that opening trade. And then, of course, they grew more rapidly because they acquired better technology. They were that poor China or India before and did incredibly well. But it even led to a revolution, the Meiji Revolution. You've heard about that in Japan. And they kicked the shoguns out. Who was the last shogun? Tom Cruise. There's a whole movie about the shoguns and the trade. Korea is also autarkic. We don't have good data, but guess what? We can measure heights. What are heights correlated with? Just caloric intake. And guess what? After free trade was forced upon Korea, people grew. They were much taller. Autarky in Spain's Franco's Spain for about 15 years. They did much better when they opened up. Here's an experiment when the Suez Canal was closed between 67 and 75. So all of a sudden trade between Asia and Europe had to go all the way around Africa. A little bit. Suez is open, right? Remember when that ship blocked Suez a couple of years ago? So it went the wrong way? Anyway, so this is raising the cost of trade. And my colleague did this study on this and found something similar to his other study, saying, gee, when you open trade, there's benefits. When you close off trade or raise the cost of trade, you're going to suffer losses. The blockade of Gaza in 2007 to 2010. An Israeli economist did this study looking at the difference between the West Bank and the Gaza in terms of per capita consumption. And guess what? West Bank is the blue line there. They're fine. Okay, standards of living rose, but in Gaza, it was flat to down at a time when the two were highly correlated. So that blockade was very costly economically to Gaza, and household welfare fell, labor productivity fell. So that's being cut off from trade is not a good thing. And there was even smuggling of KFC in the tunnels that Hamas later took over. Brexit. Was Brexit a good idea from an economic standpoint?
No. Yes, of course.
From an economic standpoint?
Of course.
So they're better off with Brexit.
Yeah.
So I'm glad we're having this debate because there's the institutional case about getting rid of the European bureaucracy, but it's also raising costs of trade because you're no longer part of this free trade agreement.
Theoretically, but they had their ways of trying at least to still, keep the benefits.
They're trying, but actually it turns out, first of all, here's what happened to the British.
The idea was to still keep, certain.
It's a better idea. Brexit is a better idea.
Here's what happens to the British pound. British pound depreciates immediately when the referendum is announced. Here's all these studies. So this is the theory. What's going to happen? Notice they're all negative, and it's between 5 and 15% or so lost per capita income. Turns out when you look at the numbers, their exports are way down, consumer prices are higher, export variety is down, here's trade share is down, this is GDP. So doppelganger is the path of Britain's economy had they not engaged in Brexit, and here's the actual path, and they're down about 5%. That's exactly what those models were saying. So maybe it was a good idea or not, but there was an economic cost to be paid by pulling out of the single market. So you other reasons to do that. Exactly. So then that's a trade-off. And they benefited from it. And the question is, well, what do the British people think? And the British people, notice here, saying, oh, more want to leave than remain. That's very uncertain around the referendum, but the economic cost has been pretty high, and now there's Brexit, there's Breg's regret. I think it's been called that. And here's right versus wrong. If they had the referendum today, knowing what they knew, they might not have undertaken that. I think we're out of time, so I will see you tomorrow. And we'll continue some of this discussion, but we'll also switch over to another topic as well.